Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. Today, my guest is Shelby Kretz. She is a UCLA doctoral student in education with a focus in urban schooling and making the connections between incarceration and schooling in America. And we will be discussing teaching social justice. So Shelby, thank you. This is our second attempt. We couldn't get the Zoom call working yesterday. So thank you for sticking with me on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about it.
Me too. And just getting started, I really appreciate you coming and talking to me about this. I've reached out to a lot of people. I have a social media, at Will Roosh is like my teaching social media. And I've reached out to a lot of people about social justice and talking about it. And it's hard to get people to talk in this platform. And I don't know why. Maybe because some of the things I post are critical of social justice. But I just want to say, up front about this is I love the concept of what social justice is trying to do and the concept as a whole. I really do. I love the pure definition of it. My concerns and my criticisms, I guess, would come from the implementation. Like, that's my concern, is like, how is this implemented, and what does this look like when we talk about privilege and power and things like that? And that's what I'd like to get into a little bit today, just sharing my experiences as a teacher, your experiences as a teacher, and trying to find where's the common ground, because this is something, and as I'm sure you get often, that is a bit polarizing down political lines and things like that. So thank you.
Yeah, it's absolutely very polarizing, but I love to dig in and, talk about the issues in a critical way and think about how we're doing it and, really have open, honest conversation, because that's the only way that we're really going to create change and, create bridges between communities to understand each other.
Yeah, and I'm such a proponent of civil, respectable discourse and critical thinking and stuff like that. And I feel like, and maybe this is just from me, and you can correct me if you see something different, but I feel like there is an unwillingness sometimes to sit in those hard conversations from people on both sides. But where I get it more is from people on the social justice progressive side of, what you're saying is, and just goes to these like labels of being racist. And, if you say that that's racist or that's, prejudice or Islamophobic or something, and that shuts it down because no one wants to be called those things. Right. And that can shut down discussion right away. If you tell me, well, you're racist, that's why you think this way, that really hurts. And I agree with you. I love having these conversations because you and I want the same thing. Mm-hmm. I think most teachers want the same thing. I think most people who are on the left and right extremes of the political spectrum at the core of it want the same thing. They disagree with maybe how to get there. And that's where we can try and find a path.
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of the challenge, I think we do need to have more conversations. I think we need more open dialogue. That's for sure. I think part of the challenge is that oftentimes people who are coming from the most marginalized communities are constantly having to defend their own identities and their own experiences, and it's exhausting. And so I really believe that we need more people with privilege to speak up and start having these conversations with people who disagree with them, because a lot of times the burden falls on people of color. It falls on people who experience injustice and experience marginalization in their lives every single day, and they're exhausted, and it's frankly, it's not their job to convince everyone else that their experiences are valid. So I agree that we need to have more conversations, but I think people with privilege and people who do hold some kind of power need to step up and start having these conversations, because it can't always fall on people of color. It can't always fall on people who are marginalized from different identities.
Yeah, so I think that's a good place to start. Well, I guess we just got right into it. Can you just give my audience a little bit of like your background and then what you're doing now, kind of what your goals are in education and things like that?
Totally, absolutely. So my background has been almost all in nonprofit work, specifically in education, working in after-school programming, working in schools, and now I'm working on my PhD in education at UCLA, as you mentioned. And recently, about a year ago, I launched a company that is focused on teaching social justice. So it's a subscription box service for parents and teachers of elementary school kids. Right now, it's elementary school only. that provides them with resources to tackle social justice issues with their very young children, so kids who are in grades K through 5. And that's what I'm working on right now. So each month it's a different theme. Parents and teachers get the box, and it provides them all the resources to talk about those themes with the kids.
And what's that called, so I can put a link in on my Instagram?
It's called Little Justice Leaders, and the website is just littlejusticeleaders.com.
Okay. Great. So I think that I keep getting these people on my podcast who are like exactly the right person to talk to. I think you're the right person to educating and social justice. Mm-hmm. So we went into privilege a little bit. Mm-hmm. There's a video on YouTube, and I did this years ago with my students where they do it with a race or a basketball court. I did it with a basketball court where I had all the kids line up the half court line, and then you read down a list of like, if your parents are together, then then you take a step forward, and then like eventually you go through this list of all these different privileges, and then they shoot a basketball, and even if you're at the back, you can still hit it. It's just harder. And then if you're right there, you just throw a layup. You can still miss a layup, but it's much easier. Yeah. So that's like I think what my go-to when I think of teaching social justice or teaching about privilege, I guess more specifically. What are your thoughts on that kind of practice?
I think that's a really good way to open the eyes of especially students who do hold a lot of privilege and haven't had the opportunity or haven't been given the tools to actually examine that privilege. So I think that's a really good way to kind of open the doors for students to look around after that kind of activity when they're standing in the front and realizing like, oh, I didn't even realize that I had these kind of privileges. I think for the students who end up kind of in the back of the line, it's just once again another reminder to them that they already knew, which is that oftentimes they're starting behind their peers because of certain societal and structural disadvantages that they have. But I think those kind of things are a really, really good way to open the minds of students who really haven't thought about privilege before.
Yeah, I guess, so with privilege, like if you look at like the maybe intersectionality matrix, there's certain things I give pushback sometimes when people talk about white privilege, and it's not because I don't believe white privilege exists. I do believe it exists. I guess my area that I'm just like kind of wrestling with is, why is white privilege like the pinnacle, where I think like IQ or alcoholism in the family, or even like attractiveness. Like my wife has in the beauty industry, she has friends who are Black and just like supermodels, and like that could be very different. Like, I guess here's like a scenario. Like if you take Will and Jada Pinkett Smith's kids, okay, so they are, maybe his daughter is, let's say Black, let's say like whatever on the intersection line. So Black, maybe let's just assume, maybe I should do this, but just assume she's like homosexual. So let's say she's a Black homosexual woman, okay, and then you say, well, she would have less privilege than. And you could take just a kid born in a trailer park in Alabama with one arm, a 70 IQ, and one alcoholic mom with lymphoma. And like, well, which one, if privilege is defined as, kind of unearned advantages in the world or in society, like, isn't it too complicated to boil down to just one or two? And if so, then why do we grab onto these one or two and not just recognize as a society that this is all really complicated? Yes, this is one, but Will Smith's kids have these, and which one is more powerful, I guess? Like, if you are white and poor, is that better or worse than being Black and wealthy? If you're white, straight, male with, born with a terminal illness, is that outshine the, disabled Muslim transgendered person who is extremely healthy? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's where it gets kind of confusing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way I like to think about it, or try to think about it, I mean, and that's what you're talking about from the beginning is intersectionality, right? So there's not a clear cut thing of like, this is better than this, or this person is more privileged than that. And I think when we get into those kind of what I call like privilege Olympics, or what I've, heard people call privilege Olympics,
Yeah.
it's like, trying to see who has it the worst, is when we've completely stepped away from any kind of attempt at solutions, any kind of attempt at unity, and we've just walked into, like, yeah, again, a privilege Olympics where people are trying to say, either these people have it better or these people have it worse, and it's more complicated than that because, like you said, someone with a lot of socioeconomic privilege is going to have a very different experience than someone who doesn't have a lot of socioeconomic privilege, regardless of race. I think, in my experience, the reason that race is often centered in conversations about social justice is, well, for one thing, it's something you certainly cannot hide. I mean, obviously, there are some people who can pass for a different race, and so that's a different thing. But for most people, when you see them, you pretty much can guess, or at least you can assume their race. Whereas, for instance, like LGBTQ, or like your sexuality is not always as clear. Sometimes people make assumptions, but it's not always as clear. You can hide that more often.
What about like attractiveness? Because that's like something that I guess is maybe a little touchy. We shouldn't talk about, but like, I'm going to. Like, it is, if you are like whatever by objective standards beautiful, like your face is symmetrical or whatever, like you have a lot of advantages. There's a lot of jokes about things. I've just heard like Greg Giraldo, stand-up comedian, talked about how he was dating a young beautiful woman, and she's like, when you go to Europe, you get off the plane and guys pull up on motorcycles and give you a free tour of the city. And he's like, no, like that your perception of what the world is, everyone's just always smiling at you because you're a beautiful woman, or if you're Zac Efron. That's a very different just way he views the world, probably, and the way people look at him. Just he's surrounded by smiling faces, maybe, compared to someone who is whatever the opposite, Steve Buscemi or something. Powerful Steve Buscemi. I don't know. But do you know what I'm saying? Like, but that doesn't show up. And like as that I've seen a lot on like social justice or things along like privilege.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, that's a very real thing, and there's research about it. I mean, it's definitely documented that people who are considered more conventionally attractive have more opportunities and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that's a really complicated issue because, one, attractiveness is so subjective, whereas with other categories, gender, race, like you can pretty much fit people into a category, whereas with attractiveness it's a spectrum, and it's a more difficult one to talk about for whatever reason in our society.
Yeah.
People don't. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. But I think if we all kind of, when we take a step back, we all see like, oh, this person is privileged, even though they don't fit these specific categories. And when I hear about social justice, it seems to be, and again, I'm more on the outside, that's why I like talking to you, is like, it seems to be we're focusing on these specific ones and ignoring these other ones, and so my background is I taught for 6 years in more like challenging areas. I'm at a private school now, so I've kind of seen like all areas of education on the high school level, and kids who are born in those situations and struggle in those situations, it's horribly sad, and they're up against so much. And I've seen, it generally didn't go down along like racial lines. Like once you're there, once you're in the classroom, you see, I was at a school that was 0% white. So it was mostly Hispanic, some Black, some Asian, but it was, some kids made good decisions and some kids made bad. And then you boiled it down to why. And it was a lot of the reason it came down to was their home life. Just where they came from. Were there two parents in the household, or was there, a system set up that guided their morals and set boundaries for them and things like that. And the kids that didn't have that it didn't even matter. 6 years, it didn't even matter if they were white or Black or anything. There was one of the things I saw was the kids who had a support system and had barriers and had parents that were involved and cared. that made a huge difference. Because I taught at a school in Philly that was like 85% Black, and it was in a neighborhood that was kind of like across the street from like the bad area of town. And it was the students. I was eighth grade. Their students. I mean, sorry, their parents were born in like the hood and got out, and now they're living with a picket fence and the whole nine. And the parents were on it. They were on their homework. They came to every parent teacher conference. They were just like in it. And as soon as their kid would like, this is 2005. So as soon as the kid would start rapping like 50 Cent or something, they'd smack the headphones off their head, be like, stop it. You're not a gangster. You have a chihuahua at home. Like, relax, go to school. Don't pretend that you're hard and blah, blah, blah. I'm from that life. You're not. Stop it. And then when I came out to LA, I would be parent teacher conference night and no one would show up. And you call home and no one would be there. And, parents are incarcerated, or parents are, just not interested or apathetic or whatever it is. And that's a big thing that I've seen. And I guess I just want to pick your brain about that. Like, how as an educator, do you think that we address that when kids are coming from that kind of environment? I know there's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. A lot of what you said, I kind of want to touch on. So, for one thing, I think it's really important first that we don't fall into a trap of saying like this person is privileged, this person is not privileged, because it's such a spectrum, and people are privileged in certain ways and disadvantaged in other ways. So I think like again, like when we get into that mindset of like, oh, this person has privilege, this person doesn't have privilege, that I think that's a trap. Everyone, or most people have privilege in some capacity. They have something, even if it's just that they're living here in America. So like most people in our country have some level of privilege, and so to say like privilege not privilege, I think is simplifying it too much. So I think we need to think about it as a spectrum. It's very non-binary.
So I want to let you go, but like, that happens to me a lot. Is people say, and you might get it too, like, well, you're white, so you don't have a say in this. And I'm just like, and that's just like, it's not productive. So I agree with what you're saying, and I appreciate that. Yeah,
because people experience privilege, and there's privileges that we see and don't see, right? You're talking about health status. There's a lot of things that when looking at someone, you don't know about what level of privilege they have. You don't know about their health status. You don't know about their sexual orientation. You don't know about their gender orientation. There's a lot of things that you can't always see. So I do think there's a lot of assumptions about like privilege, not privilege, but I think it really is more complicated than that. And I also think when we're talking about, things like, for instance, racism, obviously like that, I think that's the conversation where a lot of times people say, well, white people don't get a say. And I hear that because I think, people of color need to have their experiences heard first and foremost in the conversation about racism. But also if it's not a conversation of back and forth and a creation of understanding among all people, then it's going to be hard to get to any kind of solution if we're not involving everyone in the conversation. Which again, going back to say, like, of course that doesn't fall on people of color to facilitate that. But I do think white people need to be talking about racism, or else we have a problem if white people aren't acknowledging it.
yeah.
But anyways, so on to, you're talking about like, for instance, Black kids in middle class neighborhoods and middle class schools. You're talking about their parents being hyper vigilant about, for instance, if they, start rapping. But I think what we need to pay attention to is, one, the need for their parents to be hypervigilant because they have that disadvantage of race. So, for instance, white, middle, upper class students can go out and rap and, often appropriate Black culture and, wear hoodies and sag their pants. And their parents can let it slide as a phase that they're going through as teenagers. And they don't have to worry about their kids going out and being stereotyped and potentially even being killed because of fears that people have about what them sagging their pants and wearing a hoodie means. So I think we have to pay attention to like the need for middle class Black families to be hyper vigilant to make sure that they're able to maintain their privilege that they've got into. I think another thing we need to be very realistic about is that there are a lot of middle upper class white or middle upper class like Black families, for instance, and other families of color. But there is research out there in education that shows that even in middle class schools, Black students don't do as well. who are matched on other characteristics, including like family background and that kind of thing, income, all those things. So there's more going on in those schools that we have to look at in terms of like teacher bias, prejudice, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's why, again, that like people center so much on race, because it's just so prevalent. The bias runs so deep, and socioeconomic status can cushion the disadvantage, but it doesn't always completely, remove the disadvantage.
Yeah, like the achievement gap is a real thing, and for those like non-educators out there, just what that is that white and Asian students score better than Black and Hispanic students on standardized tests, and that, like you said, like that goes across socioeconomic lines and everything like that. Obviously, that changes it, it lessens it, but that still exists. So, what is the literature and like the education where it's at? I haven't been on a college campus in a while. Is it just chalked up to discrimination, or is it? I mean, I think it's going to be more complicated than that, obviously. But what is the reason behind the achievement gap? At its core, in your opinion, and like the opinion of like your department and stuff.
I mean, the biggest thing is just opportunities, right? So like the bulk of the achievement gap comes from the fact that our nation is segregated in terms of race and socioeconomic status, and that people of color are more likely to be living in poverty, and that students in poverty are more likely to score lower on standardized testing, and just on their grades in general. So like the bulk of it does come from like, or a lot of it comes from socioeconomic differences, but when you're looking at like within schools, like within a middle class, upper class school, and seeing those differences, that's when you start to look at racial bias in teaching. You start to look at tracking. So when you're in third grade or whatever, and your teacher decides that you're advanced or you're not advanced, that puts you on a track for life, or that your teacher decides that you're special education. And as much as we like to think that these things are objective, they're not. Usually it's a perception of a single teacher, who's most likely a white woman, deciding who in her class is smart enough to go into the advanced track, who needs to be in special education, and who's going to stay in the standard track. And those decisions that happen when kids are 7, 8 years old affect them all throughout their trajectory, through high school. And so that's a part of it. I think another part of it, I mean, is we need to look at like the racial and cultural bias written into standardized testing. So there's inherent flaws in standardized tests, that they're not quite as objective as we like to think they are. So that's a huge challenge in it. And then there's deficit thinking, right? So for instance, when we look at students who are speaking English as a second language, ironically, we tend to see this as a deficit when it's actually such a huge advantage, because when white students speak two languages, or learn a second language, we see that as a huge advantage to being bilingual. But when we see Latino students come in speaking Spanish as their first language and English as their second language, we see it as a deficit, and then they're bound to score lower on standardized tests that are written in English. So I think the tests, aren't made for everyone. They're made for middle class white students, culturally, linguistically.
Is that aimed at middle class white students, let's say, because that is like the average in America? So it's just aiming, like when you teach, you kind of shoot for the middle. So you're like, this is like the typical American. So you're going to lose kids at the top and lose kids at the bottom. I mean, I guess one other thing that I just want to promote, that I just talking to former students of mine, kids of color, like that they were told, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, like there's two kind of messages that they're getting as youth in school. One message is you can do it, you can do anything you put your mind to and all that. And then the other one is society is so stacked against you that you it's almost impossible. The achievement gap is real. You're going to score lower on these tests. It's just the way that it is. The tests are biased, all that kind of stuff. And, I do believe that people live up or down to expectations. And if the expectations are lower because of the background and history of racial injustice and just, America is racist at its core, or those kinds of like concepts. I wonder if that's doing the students a more of a disadvantage than like it's a fine balance, right? Of like recognizing you're going to have it tough and saying, tough, yes, and you can really succeed though. Like you can do it, and I'm not just saying that like you can do it sport. Like I really mean that, and people can do it, and people do it all the time. That I guess that's just like another element that I want to add to another wrinkle to make this even more complicated.
It is complicated. Yeah. So first, starting with thinking about like, are the tests made for the average American? I think it's important to remember like that the demographics are changing. So like white middle class very soon is not going to be the average or even the majority. But also, I think it's made, the tests, the system were created for white students because literally, historically, at the time that they were created, those were the only students who were going to schools, or who were at least going to these schools as they were created, because it was created, when schools were segregated, or at a time when students of color weren't even attending schools. And so again, like especially with demographics changing, obviously with the laws changing so that every student is being educated in the American school system, then we need to be changing the system, but it hasn't changed in all that time. So I think that's why the system is working for middle upper class white kids, because it was literally made for them. In terms of like the dual messaging, so like this is such a challenge with teaching social justice, and you never want to make a kid feel like the odds are so stacked against you that it's not even worth trying, right? And so like there is that like you can do it, but then also the you can do it message. We also don't want to simplify it so that they feel inferior if they're struggling, because they are coming up against structural barriers. So I do think that one, like the messaging needs to be complicated in a way that we're letting students know when we teach about these issues. Here's the reality of the world as it is now, or some of the challenges you may face, and maybe you won't, but some of the challenges you may face based on what we know about the world now. And here's what we can do about it. Here's what you can do about it. So it gives them the agency to know, like, okay, I'm aware of the system, you're conscious of what's going on, and you're giving them agency in terms of here's how you can work within the system. Here's how, for instance, teaching code switching is a huge thing. It's controversial. Some people don't like it, but I think it's really important to teach code switching. And so for people to know, code switching would be, for instance, for students to learn to speak differently in different settings, which really, most people do on a day-to-day basis anyway. So teaching kids who may not traditionally speak standard American English at home, affirming that that's okay, and that doesn't mean they're stupid, and actually being able to switch between those two different types of language makes them really smart, because that's a complicated thing to be able to do. But when you teach them to speak, for instance, standard American English in a job interview, then you're actually giving them power to be able to value their own culture, value their own way of speaking, and not ignore that and not get rid of that, but also to be able to work within the system to get to a position of power where, for instance, they can be in a position of power to say, you know what, we're not, like, if they work for a university and they decide they're gonna devalue standardized test scores in an application packet and instead look more holistically at the student. So show the student.
Is that a controversial? I'm sorry. No, I was saying, is that code switching? I love that. I think that's an important part of being an adult and growing up. And then, once you do your own thing, you look at, like I listen to Joe Rogan's podcast. He curses all the time, doesn't use proper English a lot. It's like, because he brings so much value. Or, Gary Vee, with these business people, Jay-Z maybe. Jay-Z runs all these companies. He's only going to be a billionaire. Like, he can talk any way he wants. But but he knows that he had to code switch his whole way up. When he was sitting down in a board meeting, he had to talk this way. And then in the hip hop communities, you talk this way. Like, that's just a common thing. Is that a controversial code switching? Is that controversial?
Because, there is this sense that you shouldn't have to change who you are to fit into the system. But there's also the reality of, having to do that sometimes to fit into your system. And so, for instance, Jay-Z, like you said, he can talk however he wants now. He doesn't have to code switch. It doesn't matter. He's already got enough power and privilege to do what he wants. But an 18-year-old kid trying to get a job who hasn't been taught to code switch or hasn't, is going to have a much harder time. And so it is like controversial because there's this idea of like, you shouldn't have to change who you are. You shouldn't have to hide your culture. You shouldn't have to assimilate into white culture. And I hear that. And at the same time, we have to give students agency, and we have to teach them how to work within the system if they're ever going to be able to have power and create change in the system.
Yeah, this is so like I've heard like an interview between Jay-Z and Warren Buffett, and Warren Buffett's like, an 85-year-old
Right.
man, like white guy from Nebraska. Like Jay-Z is smart enough to recognize, well, I got to talk to this guy on his level. And if it goes that way, it can get really, really sticky. I'm sure there are like white hip hop artists or something like that who can talk like that, or just white kids from, black neighborhoods who can code switch, kind of like the other way. It happens all the time. But you have to know it well, and that's an interesting thing. Is like it works both ways. So let's take a black kid and is going into an interview with some like crusty old white guy or something, and they try, but they don't actually know how to speak proper English, and they try. It sounds worse. Like it sounds like it makes them sound like, lack of a better term, dumber. And it works the other way too. You have a white kid who's trying to talk to, someone in, like black culture in some way or another. And like that can come off really bad too. So yeah, I love this idea of like just how to communicate with people who are different from you. If that's like a fundamental idea of teaching social justice, I think that's ideal. Is you're not giving up a part of yourself. You have to play the game though, and the game is complicated. And if you're all just like willing to play the game, and then if you say something that's a little off, you show grace on both directions. You show a little grace and you say, okay, well, that's not quite right, but let's like I appreciate the attempt. Like if you're in another, you're in France and you at least make an attempt to speak French. Like, okay, well, you're making an effort, so thank you. I like that idea.
And I mean, and it extends to beyond even just language, right? It's like, it's how you dress, it's how you act, it's certain behaviors, it's knowing like the intricacies of how to play this game in order to gain power and gain privilege in other areas, even if you don't have privilege in a certain area. And then I think the other half of it too is people in power having to speak up. So once you get into a position of power, right? So for instance, folks who work in a university, you can speak up and say like, hey, let's not, automatically cut out students who fall below a certain standardized test score, because we know that these standardized tests have inherent flaws. And so let's look more holistically. Or when you're, the person on the other side of a job interview and someone, you have the opportunity to speak up for, more equity in the process, for reaching a more diverse audience in terms of getting the job application out there, for being more open to, all different kinds of things. So it also is the flip side, like more people in the power have to speak up then, to be able to change the system from the inside too.
Yeah, so you brought up equity, and so I think you and I are really on the same page with a lot of this stuff. So trying to find something we disagree on. Hammer this out a little bit. Like when you bring up equity, I have real issues with the concept of equity, and I love equality. So in that way, I'm like, I guess like a classical liberal type thinker. I guess my issue with equity is I've seen like where that mindset goes. Like if it's taken to the extreme, just as a history teacher with the socialist experiments and communism and things like that, and these ideas of, trying to level the playing field. I don't know how, would it be ideal if, let's say, African Americans are 13% of the American population. Would it be ideal if we had 13% of congressmen and 13% of neurosurgeons be black and stuff like that? Like, yeah, I suppose. I want discrimination based on competency though. And I worry about things like quotas or things along those lines that kind of forces it. Like, I think that the method matters. The equity outcome is great. I would love to see a lot of diversity in every realm, but as long as they are competent, and quotas kind of by definition will get the opposite. So just an example would be, and I'll use like a not commonly held one would be like let's say with like gender. So for if you have like a computer science position, or Google is hiring 10 engineers, okay, and they say we're going to have 5 women and 5 men, okay, or just let's just say like, we can do white and black too, 5 black people, 5 white people, and overwhelmingly more people are computer science majors who are white and male. So for those 5 positions, you have 1,000 white men applying for the job, and then you have, let's say, 100 women or 100, black people applying for that job or something like that with those degrees. Well, statistically, you will get worse. Like you will get worse. You could get some phenoms, of course. Okay, there are amazing female coders and black coders and stuff, of course. But I'm saying as a whole, you do that across a whole system, you are going to get an inferior engineer eventually. And you do the same thing with like pre-K teaching and men and versus women. You're going to get 5 guys to apply for a pre-K job, and you're going to get maybe 200 women. Mm-hmm. So I guess, yeah, how do we achieve equity? Those are like just my concerns, and I just want to hear your thoughts. But like, those are my concerns with equity, is like the method of how we get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that, at first I'm going to start by explaining what I'm talking about when I say equity versus equality, just so people know where we're at. So when I talk, if I'm talking about equality, I'm talking about like everything being the same, right? Everything standing equal for everyone. And when I talk about equity, what I'm talking about is making sure people have what they need and the support that they need. So like, it's as simple as that, which I'll come back to that. But in terms of your example with the computer science, right? I think it's a Band-Aid solution to say, we're going to hire 5 women and 5 men. Right. It's a solution that's used very commonly, but it's a Band-Aid that's not looking at the most important question, which I think a person of who really is caring about social justice would look at that problem and not say, how do we make this equal or equitable and hire women? But I think the question is, why are the applicants overwhelmingly white and male? And when we answer that question, I think that's the heart at how do we get to a more just society? How do we create systems that allow women, that allow people of color, and even encourage them in the same way that we encourage white men to go into that specific profession? And the same could be said for teaching pre-K, right? How do we create a system that dismantles gender dynamics so much that men don't feel like it's not a career path for them to choose? Pre-K education. So I think it's looking more at the root of the problem as opposed to trying to solve it after the problem's already been manifested in society in inequality. So then in terms of like, going back to equity, I think the biggest way I like to think about equity in schooling is do students have what they need? Because once we create equity and opportunity, we will see equality in the outcomes. So we will see more women, more people of color with degrees in computer science as soon as those groups have the same opportunity to get the degrees in computer science. So I think like we need to think not just about like, we want equal outcomes, right? We want 13% of Congress to be Black. More importantly, it's do we have equal opportunity at the beginning? And that doesn't mean, and here's where it comes in the difference between equity and equality. That doesn't mean everyone gets the exact same thing. And I think the easiest way to think about this, what my advisor at UCLA, Dr. Pedro Noguera, constantly uses this example for parents, right? You have 2 kids. So the question for you is, do you always treat your kids 100% equally?
No,
right.
No. You give them what
exactly.
They need,
you
right?
give them what they need. If one of your kids, for instance, has a vision problem, you go to the eye doctor, and one of your kids has 20/20 vision, and the other one, the doctor says you need glasses. You're not going to get them both glasses, right? Even if it's not fair, only the kid who needs glasses is going to get glasses. It's not equal. Well, it is fair. See, it's not equal, but it's fair. The kids get what they need. Right. The same with like braces, right? You're not going to get braces for a kid who doesn't need braces. Even if your other kid does need them, it's not going to be equal across the board. And so parents with multiple kids, I think, understand this idea very inherently of like, oh yeah, of course, like you don't treat your kids exactly equal. And so I think the same rules need to apply in the education system where, for instance, kids with more privilege, kids with more support at home, kids with, other advantages in their life don't need the exact same thing from our education system to get the same outcomes. And so but I think we're completely failing in thinking about that as an education system. We're actually doing the reverse, which makes no sense. So our public schools that have more affluent kids are actually get more funding from the government than schools that have less affluent kids. So we're actually doing the opposite of equity in our schools right now.
Yeah, and I think it's mixed up because I say like gender and race, and those two are very different things because gender has a biological component that's pretty significant. I mean, I think that there is an element to pre-K teaching that it's just maybe the thing that I've heard before that seems to ring true with me is, as a whole, if you look at big generalities, women are more interested in careers that are focused on people and men on things, and things are more easily scalable and stuff like that. I think that just men, it's been teaching for 14 years, like boys don't want to be carrying. I brought my 2-year-old into school on Friday. We had a half day and all the girls were like, oh, he's so cute. He's so cute. He's so cute. And then like the guys are just like, there's an element of that biologically. You see that in the Scandinavian countries because they're very egalitarian. And yet the disparities in like engineering and things like that got wider. But then with something like being like a medical doctor, it was like a 50-50 because it's kind of both people and things. Where race is something that is a social construct. So if there are less, African Americans or in STEM or something like that, then that's something I think that is. We have to look at. There isn't really a biological element of, Black people like science or they don't. There is probably something more systemic about that. I guess, so when we talk about, giving people what they need, this is so tricky. I had a podcast, it was like my 3rd episode, and with a guy who now I'm like, in my head, we're like best friends because I just think he's so awesome. But he lost both his legs with a disease he had, and he got him amputated when he was in his mid-20s. And as he was getting his legs amputated, on the screen of the hospital, he saw people running the Ironman triathlon. He said, "I'm going to do that." And now he's doing it, and he's just like an incredible guy. And there's something to that we talked about in that podcast, which is like if you have disadvantages, and there are a lot of different disadvantages that people have and stuff like that, and then you are privileged and you have a more paved path, like there is something real that human beings are. I like the term anti-fragile. I've heard that before. It's like a Nassim Taleb book. Like if you have a paved pathway and then someone has hurdles, a bunch of things they have to jump over. Well, you know what? Hurdles build big legs. Like they make you stronger. And yes, there's going to be challenges in front of you. Like at what point do we say, hey, let's give them, the glasses, the braces, let's get rid of those hurdles. Is that doing them a service or a disservice? That's a really tough thing. I don't know the answer. I'm curious on your thoughts on it. The Jay-Z example, he was doing an interview with Howard Stern, and Howard's like, when you're in these board meetings with all these people from Stanford and Harvard and stuff, are you intimidated? And he's like, no. He's like, they took a path. They had tutors. They went to these schools. He took the traditional path. He's like, my path is much harder. So when I'm sitting in that boardroom, when I'm there and I'm at the same level, I am prepared. No one can throw me for a loop because I had all these hurdles. So that's what I guess I get to is like, what is the braces or the glasses for a kid? Because their coping mechanisms that they're going to have to deal with without getting the braces or glasses might be something that leads to them being far above everyone else. Do you know what I mean?
I mean,
that's
I think
just something I'm curious your thoughts on it.
It's complicated, right? Because jumping over hurdles can definitely make your legs stronger, unless the hurdles are too high for you to jump over, and then stop you in your tracks. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the difference. So for instance, a kid who cannot see 2 feet in front of them can't learn to read without glasses, period. Like there's not really a way to do it unless they're reading Braille. A kid with kind of blurry vision can overcome that and still read. So I think we have to ask, how high are the hurdles and how realistic is it to ask the kids to jump over them? And then I think another thing that, like, most people who are considered to have a lot of privilege, right? Like even straight white men who don't have a disability and, who maybe, from the outside hold a lot of privilege. I think a lot of those people would still argue that they've faced hurdles in their life, that they're still jumping hurdles. Yeah. So I think to say like, oh, well, we need to keep these hurdles up for these other people is almost implying that straight white men who don't have a disability don't jump hurdles themselves. And they do. So,
Yeah, I hear you saying that. Yeah, I think that's an important recognition because again, I've been told that. I've been told, by people, well, you don't know. It's easy for you. One of the things that I actually did last year was I did a 7-day water fast where I just drank water for 7 days,
yeah.
and it was hard. And part of the reason I did it was because I don't care what race you are, I don't care what gender you are, I don't care what sexual identity is, I don't care about anything. To just when you live in Los Angeles and there's fast food everywhere and in and out, like hitting your nostrils all the time, like to go without food is hard. And I want to just like show like, yeah, I can do hard things too. Like, and I can overcome, I have hardships, even if I put them on myself. There is, that recognition that everyone has it hard and just our paths are a little bit different. And some people have it harder, but even that's hard to measure. And so let's just have empathy for one another, even the straight, white, waspy male like myself, like just so people are so quick to judge. I wonder if you might even get that just being, white yourself, like just like you, it's this weird thing of you could never know what it's like to be me, but you must know what it's like to be me. It's like, well, which one is it? Like, because we're trying,
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just curious about your kind of experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, I get that too. I mean, a lot of people, I mean, I do get the criticism from some people that I shouldn't even be doing this work because I'm white. And I hear that because, I don't have the lived experience of a person of color, but I do have other experiences, obviously. But yeah, so I mean, it's a challenging thing. I really believe everyone hopefully should be working on some kind of like activism and justice and trying to make the world a more kind, compassionate place.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, in terms of the hurdles, like everyone has challenges. And so, for instance, if we say if we could someday, hopefully, knock down the hurdle of racism, knock down sexism and, homophobia and transphobia and all of these other things, all of those people, right? The LGBTQ people, the people of color, the women, they're still going to face hurdles. And the beauty of it is then they actually have, hopefully, more energy and, more ability to create their own bigger hurdles. So when you talked about like, the white men who had an Ivy League education, maybe because they weren't up against racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever it is, they could set bigger hurdles for themselves, and they had the energy and the ability to like jump higher, and more people could do that and set higher bars for their own self if they weren't having to jump over 5 million hurdles just to get to the starting line. So I think like if we can like eliminate a lot of these things, what we would see is a lot more people being able to jump a lot higher in general, to continue with the metaphor.
Absolutely. And just the more that the listeners like just have recognize that solutions and movement forward in a great direction can come from anywhere. I use as examples like Earl Haas and Greg Pincus. I just wrote down the name. Like Earl Haas created the tampon. Greg Pincus created the birth control pill. Like if those aren't the two probably biggest things to get women to be unchained and get out and be successful, like I don't know what it is. And there's two men. So like I know I haven't lived your experience, but I can help. William Lloyd Garrison or Harry Beecher Stowe writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, just like people going, oh, all right, yeah. Like help can come from all directions. And I just the more that we can, I think that's a big reason why I wanted to talk about this is I think there is a group, probably more on the conservative side, that are told over and over again, your opinion doesn't matter or something along those lines. And I don't want to go down that road. And I definitely do not believe that that's most common opinion, but it is one, it's at least a perception of a lot of probably like straight white people that that's what they're up against.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a problem because, like you said, I don't think it's the majority of people. I think the majority of people want more people out here like fighting for justice and fighting for compassion. Really, what I say, like, I mean, to boil it down, I'm like, what I'm trying to do is teach kindness and compassion, and understanding. Like that's it. But I think most people want more people out there. But I think the perception that you're not welcome, or the fear of speaking about it. I think especially white people have a really big fear of speaking about race. But a lot of people, straight people have a huge fear about speaking about LGBTQ issues. And to some extent, like they should, like you better educate yourself a little bit first before you just decide to jump in and throw your opinion in there. But at the same time, like, we need people standing up for these issues. We need dialogue. We need people of power, fighting for more equity, more equality. So yeah, I kind of lost where I was going with that, but I think it's important to bring in everyone.
Yeah, and that's, we're just about an hour, so I think that's actually a great way to. There's other stuff that I would love to talk. I could talk about this forever, but I think that get to know people is a big thing. Have conversations like you and I are having. Like I hope that the podcast will just start dialogue, and then go talk to someone who's different than you in any way. I'm very fortunate that I'm around a lot of different cultures and a lot of different people. And, my kids have like a black godmother and a gay godfather, like, so they're around a lot of stuff. You start to see people as individuals, and when you see people as individuals, that's just an important thing of like, oh, it's not just like this group needs this. It's, oh, Timmy needs this and Susie needs this. And I'm going to be there for Susie because oh, this person kind of reminds me of Susie's story. Oh, I know Susie said that this helped her, so I'm going to go help her in this way, or something along those lines. But we're so insular, we're so like isolated and segregated, even in social media, which is such a beautiful thing. I mean, I found these people for this podcast on social media. We should use it to get to know people, not just retire to our echo chambers and sit in what's comfortable. Like, let's sit in something that's a little uncomfortable and have grace toward one another when we screw up, about how we're wrong, and then how maybe we're just missing each other, because a lot of people have common goals. We have common goals of making sure that people feel like they can go out. There is such untapped, just like genius in these like inner city, like really bad schools. Like there are kids who like these like drug dealers and stuff are so entrepreneurial. Like they're so good. And these kids, I've seen them. You've seen them. Like they're these geniuses that if they were just put in a different situation, they could come up with something incredible that everyone would benefit from. It's not a zero-sum game anymore. Like, it's not like the old days where you have this, I want this, so I take it from you. My success, my power is at your, detriment. We can use resources better now. You can become a billionaire helping the world now, which is incredibly awesome. So let's all work together. It sounds kind of cliche and corny, but let's work together to get there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, it goes so fast, but I'm gonna eventually get to the point where they're like 3-hour podcasts. But Shelby, is there anything that you want to, where people can just like go other than Little Justice Warriors? Is there any way that people can, any advice for people listening, or any way that they can reach you or anything like that before we sign off?
I'd say just the biggest thing is to keep talking about these issues, especially with kids. It's uncomfortable sometimes. We don't always know what we're doing, but I think opening the dialogue and getting kids talking about these things is what's going to help create a more inclusive world, and a world full of people who actually care for other humans, which is really all I'm trying to do. In terms of like finding my work, the best place to go is littlejusticeleaders.com. You can check out the blog, check out the work that we do, and on the social media, I'm constantly posting tips for teachers and parents. So if you check out our social media accounts, it's a good way to get information and ideas for how to start these conversations.
Okay, Shelby, thank you sincerely for being on here. I enjoyed this conversation a lot, and I think one of the biggest things, like I have these like takeaways. One of the biggest things I got is like we're not far apart. I was thinking the UCLA, social justice department is like so different from where I'm thinking we should be headed, and it's not.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important lesson. And that's a big takeaway for me. So thank you
Yeah.
sincerely for doing this. And I look forward to continuing conversations with you in the future.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Will.
All right.